And when we talk to providers especially, none of them are excited about using single-use laryngoscope systems. And if there was clarity in this, and if there was a standardization, I really do think that hospitals would be able to go back and be able to justify getting the product that they really do want to be using.
Public health. It's on everyone's mind these days, from hand washing to emerging pathogens. Welcome to Transmission Control, an infection prevention podcast focused on your appetite for trailblazing thought, discussion, and innovations that will help you make informed decisions. Each episode, we speak with public health experts and safety champions from across the globe as they share their experiences, passion, and opinions. From investigative journalism to medical publications, we tackle real-world barriers to halting the spread of disease. Whether you are tuning in for education, inspiration, or to hear the stories that need to be told, thank you for joining us. And now, get ready to blast off with your weekly injection of insight on transmission control.
This week on Transmission Control, we speak with Christian Berling, Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Heine USA. And in full transparency, I've known Christian for a little over a year now and interviewed him on one of my other podcasts called Beyond Clean. And then, Larry, you listened to that episode and said, hey, I know Christian. I've known him for a while, and we've had a long, ongoing conversation and discussion about improvements in the industry, and said, why don't we have him come on the show and just talk about, that whole process? Because I think it began back in 2007, Larry, and, it's just coming to fruition over the last several years. And I just think this is such a great way to talk about how improvements are made in the medical device and healthcare industry.
Yes, I think this is going to be a fascinating interview. I did work with Christian, our guest, about a decade ago to optimize the quality of a device, the rigid laryngoscope, and specifically to develop a set of cleaning and disinfection or reprocessing instructions. So I'm very interested in us discussing kind of the evolution of a device's design and its reprocessing requirements. And I also want to focus on variations in the standard of care and talk a little bit about how different manufacturers may have different reprocessing instructions for use, which arguably is not ideal. We're going to talk a bit about device classifications, non-critical, semi-critical, and critical, and what are the minimum standards or minimum requirements for reprocessing those devices to prevent disease transmission. And then we're going to talk a little bit about state guidelines, such as the California state guideline that in 2007 the state adopted in response to a set of guidelines that I uniquely had published. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Joint Commission standards and how that may differ from state guidelines and how surveyors will inspect hospitals and ensure that they're reprocessing the blade and the handle safely.
All right. Well, don't go anywhere because this is a great story we're going to be telling today. We're going to be back after a short break with Christian Berling, Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Heine USA. I'm Justin Poulin.
And I'm Dr. Lawrence Muscarella.
From 17 Studios, let's get into it. This is Transmission Control.
Joining us now is Christian Berling, Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Heine USA. And Christian, this is not the first time we've talked. Actually, the reason that we invited you to join us here on Transmission Control is because you did an interview on one of our sister podcasts called Beyond Clean, which is focused on the sterile processing industry. And we talked a lot about a process. I want to leave a little bit on the table for Larry. We talked about the process that you went through, and it really tied very much to publications in the industry and how it changed how you approach the industry in manufacturing and some of the things that you did as an organization around instructions for use regarding reprocessing. And I really want to talk today, because Larry was very much a part of that, I want to talk today about that process and some lessons learned at a high level. So if anybody, just as we're kind of teeing up this conversation today, wants to check that out, just subscribe to Beyond Clean podcast and then look for the vendor spotlight with Christian Berling at Heine, and you'll get some details, but not not all of the details that we're going to talk about today. So, Christian, thanks so much for coming on the show yet again, I guess.
No, my pleasure. Thank you very much. We really did enjoy the first podcast. So I really appreciate being invited back and really excited to talk about this topic from a little bit of a different perspective.
So Larry listened to our interview and then he said, hey, I was part of that conversation. I would really like to talk to Christian too, on the Transmission Control podcast. And so that's kind of how it all came together. And Larry, I'd love for you to kind of talk about, maybe just set the table with what you were seeing in the industry around, 2007, maybe talk about what you wrote, and then we can kind of leap off there for the conversation.
All right. Thank you, Justin. Christian and I go back some years. I would say a decade or more ago, Christian and I started talking about issues that have to do with, for example, the chicken or the egg coming first. And how does that apply to instrument reprocessing, cleaning, and disinfection? Well, kind of like this. The issue came up with what we call a rigid laryngoscope, which is an instrument that many of the listeners are familiar with and can be used for intubations, etc. And Christian can talk a little bit more about the clinical applications of the device. But I was focusing on the reprocessing, and I found the paradigm that we use with gastrointestinal endoscopes becoming fully immersible, that parts of the gastrointestinal endoscope or the bronchoscope, parts of it do not touch the patient. And yet the way the guidelines reasonably and appropriately are written is that we want a fully immersible gastrointestinal endoscope or flexible endoscope so that even those parts of the endoscope that don't necessarily contact the patient are still reprocessed, that is cleaned and disinfected or sterilized in the same manner. And when I then started moving into the world of rigid laryngoscopy, I found that the blade and the handle, though they contact one another and both can be contaminated with potentially pathogenic organisms, I found a bit of a dichotomy there where the handle was not being reprocessed the same way the blade was being reprocessed. And this kind of confused me and caused me to research this further. And then I came out with, circa 2006, 2007, the recommendation that the blade and the handle both be considered semi-critical devices, and both then receive at least high-level disinfection or sterilization. Let me kind of stop there and then say, Christian, is my memory correct? Did I get that all accurate? And then we can kind of follow from there, where then California adopted my unique recommendation, referencing my work and saying throughout the state, as of 2006, 2007 specifically, they wanted staff to then follow this recommendation I'd come up with, treat the blade and the handle similarly, and then that kind of opens some can of worms that maybe, Christian, you can then address if I have all my facts correct.
Absolutely. And you're exactly right. This is a continuation of conversations we had over a decade ago. And, from our perspective as a manufacturer, and when we talk about a laryngoscope system, we think of blade and handle. The two, one cannot be used without the other. So we really do view them as one product, so to speak. And when this became an issue, and we talked about this kind of around that 2011 timeframe, where let's say then it just kind of bubbled up and became an important topic. And I know it had been going on before that. But, when that started, bubbling up for us, that was where the real confusion came from, is we've got these two components that work together, that interact with each other. Why are they considered different when it comes to reprocessing? And that's where a lot of the confusion came from, and where we really had to go back and look at how we were preparing our IFUs and actually how we were designing the products as well. So absolutely on the same page.
And so I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to ask this very important question, and you've just teed me up for it. And it has to do with whether reprocessing always places patient safety and decontamination first, or whether it's appropriate maybe that reprocessing dovetail with convenience. So in other words, it seems to me that the handle and the blade would always have been treated as one instrument. They would always have been subjected to high-level disinfection at a minimum. Correct me if I'm wrong. But the reason why, and let's move forward 4 years from 2007 to 2011, the reason why, and for our listeners in 2011, the Joint Commission released new guidance for the processing and storage of the laryngoscope blades. And with regard to the handles, the Joint Commission said that they are considered contaminated, and that, for example, low-level disinfection, using a low-level surface disinfectant wipe, might be appropriate. And I kind of walked away saying, even before 2011, during that year and then afterwards, is that recommendation one because it's just convenient and staff will comply with it, not totally taking into consideration the infection risks? Or is it one that is really evidence-based and sound? So what is coming first? Does the practice precede the guideline and the guideline kind of tries to accommodate the practice? Or should the guideline always come first and then the practice dovetail and comply with that guideline? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. And of course, this is all just, purely hypothetical. I personally believe that, and this is the way that we design our product, is you start with, when we're making a product, we talk about what does the product need to do first and foremost. Make sure that it does that, and everything goes from that. Everything follows from that. And I believe cleaning processes or reprocessing should be the exact same way. What environment is the product going to be used in? And then you define, and this is what we did with the new handle, for instance, and we defined, okay, what are the regulations around it? And we need to design the product not only that it does the intended use, but then that it can be reprocessed or clean to be safe in this instance to that highest level. So that's how we believe it should be done. Now, in terms of what was happening before, I do think there was an element of it was common practice to just wipe these down, that people just viewed, handle and blade as being completely different. I think blades, as far back as I can remember, even going back to the original conventional blades that had bulbs in them, they would remove the bulb and they would sterilize the blade, and the handles just got wiped down.
Why differently? Why were they not the same in terms of the reprocessing requirement?
Well, this is where speculation comes, and I think this is where, from my perspective, and as well, where you go and you look at our product now and our new handle and what we were able to do with it and seeing how difficult it is that they are two drastically different types of products. Blades have evolved when fiber optics came in. They're very simple products. They really are. If you look at ours, they're 304 grade stainless steel. We've got coatings on them, nickel and chrome coatings. We've got epoxies that seal up the fiber optics. There's, no ridges. They're all smooth surface. Very easy just to run through a very standard reprocessing process down at SPD. You can autoclave them. You can put them in a stereo. You name it. No big deal. Handles, though, get very complicated. You've got illumination systems. You've got circuitry. You've got batteries. You've got ridges. All of these different, like I say, elements that are built into that make it a very difficult product to reprocess at a higher level. So I think part of it might have come from the complexity of the product and saying, look, we can't take these things apart. We can't do this. The easiest thing that we can do is just wipe them down. So I think that's what contributed to people, let's say, separating the two and say, okay, it's easy to do this one that way. It's easy to do this one this way. And I think what's interesting, though, is if I actually look at it from a handle perspective, what's viewed as simple and easy with the handles in terms of wiping it down actually had more of a detrimental effect on the operation of the handle than, quite frankly, today.
Can you explain, please?
Sure, absolutely. So they're using these saturated wipes to wipe these handles down, and they're immensely saturated, and they're about anywhere from 60 to 70% water. Well, you look at the top of the handles and the way that they're designed, they're open. And when you get liquid goes down in, it's making contact with the bulb, all of the contact points from the bulb and the handle, from the handle to the batteries. We would get these into our repair facility, and they would be oxidized. There would sometimes be liquid that would actually come out when you open them up. They were never really designed for that kind of, let's say, that type of reprocessing. So it was actually interesting that people defaulted to that and said, okay, this is the easiest thing to do. But with that decision, they were actually compromising, in our mind, they were compromising the reliability and the functionality of the product.
What did you do to make that product function better and be more reliable and have a lower risk of exposing patients to potential pathogens?
Sure. Well, that's where you come in, to be honest with you. So when I spoke on the podcast about 2011, that's when there was a change. And then I'd say that's when the focus on the IFUs became more, let's say, more scrutinized. And that's where it took us a little bit of time to realize it was the discrepancy between blade and handle and how the handle was characterized. And, we looked back at, the 2010, 2009 timeframe where we had been very successful with our handles in California because of your guidance and your recommendation and what they adopted going into the StairAd machine. So to be honest with you, at that point, we just knew that our product was compatible. And we didn't really look into why and what was actually going on with the regulation. But when we started doing our research several years later, that's when we, of course, realized that California has a different regulation. So first thing we did when we were looking at doing a new product is we said, okay, we've got 49 states do it one way, one does it the other. And the one way that they do it is much more, in our mind,
stringent and robust.
Absolutely. And made much more sense. And we said, okay, we have to design to that standard. So we did. And one of the things that we looked at doing based on that standard, but also kind of addressed this problem of wiping the handle down, was making the handle waterproof and saying, okay, you can sterilize it if you want in a StairAd with the batteries in it. The illumination system will be fine. But let's say in the other 49 states, if you do want to wipe the handle down, we've now sealed up all the illumination so that you can effectively, and I tell the funny story about Oliver Heine, who's our CEO, third generation family owner of the company, tested the handle in his pool for 3 days. He took it home for a weekend, put a handle in the pool, brought it back to the office on Monday, and it worked fine. So sealing everything up, just solved that problem. But we had never gone down that road before.
So you made it fully immersible. Did you say you also made the handle steam autoclavable?
Yes, sir. So we do. And the way that we do our IFU now is we give, because the regulations are different, not just in California, there's actually some hospital systems that have their own internal regulations. Some of them are actually following the California Your guidelines. They're doing that internally, which is great, even though their state regulation might not. But we just figured that look, when we walk in, we have the best system on the reusable blade side. When it comes to the handle, we have the best handle system in terms of not just performance, but flexibility. So we go in and we speak with the SPD department and say, look, how do you guys, and speak with anesthesia, sometimes infection control. And we say, look, how do you want to reprocess these? To what level? And if they say sterilization, we say, okay, well, we've got two options there. You can StairAd the handle complete, and that's illumination system and the batteries. If they wanted to autoclave it, the weak link in the chain there is not the handle, but actually the batteries. So the only caveat with putting it into a steam autoclave is you'd have to remove the batteries.
That's fine. Yes, that's understandable. So that all makes
sir.
sense. And did anyone else do it? I mean, you clearly have done it right. Does anyone else do it as right, or are you kind of the vanguard and the trailblazer and you're out there on your own?
We're out there on our own, and this has been since 2018. And I know what went into it, and I know it's not easy. And there's a couple things that actually came up to that point as well. Not just on the high level disinfection and sterilization side are we alone, but also on the low level disinfection side. So one of the things that we found out when we started doing our initial research is our original handle, which is very similar to almost every other reusable handle out there. They've got the very fine, let's say, knurled finish on the outside, and a lot of them have green rings on them for the ISO standard. All of those things made it impossible for us to validate a low-level disinfection process. So when we sent it to the lab, we weren't able to meet the standard of low-level disinfection because of those features in the design of the product. So when we did the new handle, not only did we, make sure that it would handle the high end or that most stringent sterilization, but also going all the way back down to low level. So we redid the outside of the handle, so it's got more of what we call a wave grip. So there's no, fine little crevices. We got rid of all the plastic on the handle, so there's none whatsoever. We print the ISO standard on there so people know that they're compatible with other ISO compliant products. But now it's actually the only product, not only that you could put the entire handle in, and we have it validated from ASP on a StairAd, for instance, all the way down to we have a validated wipe down procedure that no one else has. So we always, when we go into a customer and we say, here's our IFU, but also here's all the validated lab testing on all of the processes that we recommend. So we are alone in that category. Yes, sir.
So I would be remiss if I didn't address this point briefly, and I'm very interested in your comments in this. We have a situation then where, depending on where you are in the United States, depending in what state you are, what jurisdiction, that we don't so much have, for example, the Joint Commission telling us, the hospital, what to do, but allowing the manufacturer to write the IFUs, we call them the instructions for use, let the manufacturers write them and let the hospital decide what it wants to do. And I think if that paradigm were applied to GI endoscopes, we would have a problem. In other words, if we allowed the manufacturer to simply write the instructions any way they wanted for disinfecting the endoscope and allowed states then to adopt anything from low-level disinfection up to sterilization, we would be all over the map. I favor, as my listeners have known for me and readers for many years, standardization of care, where we don't have different guidelines, different IFUs, different practices. We have one standard of care. What are your thoughts on that?
I couldn't agree more, to be honest with you. And that was the hardest thing for us as a manufacturer. Was we were getting the phone calls and having hospitals ask us what our recommendation was for reprocessing their product. And that just seemed, number one, we were not prepared for it. But number two, it just didn't make sense to me. That didn't seem like it was something that we should be doing. We always felt it was something that should be, whether it's a governing body, whether it's the CDC, FDA, whether it then goes down to the Joint Commission, they should be defining it. And then we as the manufacturers should be meeting that. I feel if the manufacturers are left to their own devices, of course, I hate to say this, but you're going to write an IFU or you're going to have a standard that meets the design of your product or what its capacities are, as opposed to the other way around.
And the convenience of your customer, which may be great for your customer, but not necessarily great from a health standpoint for your patient.
Oh, absolutely. And I can't tell you how many customers we lost. And, it was a bitter pill to swallow, but I think, for us, as a company and why we exist and we care about patient safety, we care about performance and the, how our products help our customers. From our perspective, we lost a ton of customers because we took a stand and said, look, we're not going to dumb things down. We are not going to, I can't tell you how many times we've been asked to change our IFUs from customers and say, can you just write it? If you can write it this way, we'll give you the business. And we said, no, we absolutely refuse to do it. I wish there was standardization and then there wasn't so much gray area. And then every product could be evaluated on its performance, but then also when it comes to reprocessing, we could all be measured against the same standard. I do wish that would happen.
Do you know of another type of instrument where the IFUs are written not because of a general universal standard? In other words, where a particular instrument that could, if not directly, indirectly contact a patient's mucous membranes, such as the handle. Are you familiar with another type of instrument, maybe having nothing to do with anesthesia, where there's a similar paradigm, which, as I've said, readers and listeners are very familiar with me being a little bit of a stickler for detail, where I favor a single standard of care? Are you familiar with any other instance or medical device where something similar is done, where the guideline kind of allows the manufacturer to write the standard the way they want vis-a-vis the level of disinfection or sterilization that's required?
The only thing I can think, and I'm not sure if this completely fits, is funny that when we were going through a lot of this, one of the young ladies that works with us, her father is a dentist, and we always found it interesting because we would get a lot of feedback on, people debating whether or not it should be sterilized and, even the blade, and this and back and forth. And I found it interesting that in a dentist's office, all of their hand instruments, no one would think twice. They don't think twice about the fact that they sterilize them between every patient, and there's not a patient that would sit down in a chair and have one of those instruments used on them if they didn't know that the entire thing had been sterilized after the previous patient had been in that chair. I always found that fascinating that in that one particular instance, it was absolutely the standard and no one would question it whatsoever. But then when we move over to, I think is even a more critical
invasive
application. Exactly.
Yes.
That people, it's all over the map. And when we would make a stand and say, this is what we believe, that people would push back. And I think maybe that goes back to earlier on that people just want status quo and they say, this is simple and this is easy.
So you raised an excellent point. I very much appreciate it. The listeners really will appreciate the dental handpiece analogy. And maybe as a result of our conversation today, we can kind of get more universal care and go more in that direction. Thank you for that.
Oh, good. I'm glad that worked. I wasn't sure.
So, I mean, I feel like we've done a nice job of kind of talking about how the standard of care has changed to a pretty good deal. But what about just the whole classification system? As you're talking about trying to get towards standardization, right? I feel like there's almost something that's been sort of, I don't know, almost fundamentally not incongruent. Maybe that's the best way to say it. Fundamentally incongruent in terms of classification with the handle and the blade. And so if you were to try to do standardization, wouldn't that be an obvious area for improvement as well, Christian?
No question. I think that the logic behind the California, what their specific mandate is, which is if a semi-critical instrument is attached to something else, then that whole system then becomes semi-critical. I absolutely think that makes sense, and that standardization should be, without sounding silly, should be the standard. I think it would eliminate a lot of confusion. I think it would allow people to focus. I think that a lot of people, quite frankly, are not using the type of system that they want to use and would prefer using, whether they admit it or not, because of that point. And, again, this is pure speculation, but I think there's a lot of facilities out there that wish that there was clarity in this so that they could justify getting away from potentially, single-use product, which when we talk to providers, especially, none of them are excited about using single-use laryngoscope systems. And if there was clarity in this, and if there was a standardization, I really do think that hospitals would be able to go back and be able to justify getting the product that they really do want to be using.
Can you discuss briefly what is the problem with the single-use rigid laryngoscopes compared to the reusable? I would think maybe a disposable rigid laryngoscope might be the way to go if I were a materials management or infection control practitioner. What is the
especially with the sustainability piece? I mean, this is the ongoing debate, right?
Sure.
Is it a supply chain issue? What is the concern?
Well, I think that's part of the current issue. But, what we've seen, let's say in the last decade where disposables have certainly become the dominant, let's say, the, product being used in the ORs, which it was never that case prior to, 2012, 2013. I think what happened is with all of this confusion and with the Joint Commission coming in and all of the, hospitals not knowing who to turn to, they would go to the manufacturers. This kind of goes, the whole thing was systemic. And this, again, you kind of go with the chicken and the egg. It was, manufacturers from day one didn't have good IFUs. There was no clarity in the standards. So then hospitals came back to us and started asking us what we should do. We were in the same boat as everybody else in 2012 and 13 when people were calling us. We didn't know what to tell them. We were providing them with incomplete IFUs that, disposables were a great, let's say, port in the storm. And it made sense. It was kind of an insurance policy against this potential liability that they were in. The problem with disposables, there were certainly some improvements to them. I mean, early disposables were all plastic, and they weren't necessarily, I'd say, durable, or didn't have that. They weren't robust enough. And then with the advent of the metal ones and with LEDs, they got a bit better. But what we've seen over the last several years is everybody moved that way. They followed the money, and all of the reusable manufacturers that we used to compete with back in the mid early 2000s, everyone shifted their focus to disposable, and with competition came pricing issues, and they started lowering the price every year in and year out. Pricing started going down, and when you're dealing with a disposable product, when price starts going down, the quality and the reliability of that product starts going down. And what we have seen is, and this is all, information that you can get in public, is if you go on and look at the MAUDE reports on the FDA and you see how many issues they have with them breaking, them not working, coming out of the packaging. This is that race to the bottom. When you're selling on price, you're always, going to be a race to the bottom to save that next penny. And eventually it's the reliability of the product that will suffer. Whereas with a reusable, at least the way that we design our products to last anywhere from, 10 to 15 years on average. It's a different philosophy of selling on price versus quality. And I think that's what's happened. And to your point, now you've got You've got raw materials are becoming an issue, the pricing of them. So people are getting ready to see the cost of those disposables go up drastically, but the quality is not going to be improving. Availability, supply chain issues right now are becoming an issue as well.
Okay, so we've talked about, as we tie things up here, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I'm hoping that listeners to this podcast will actually affect change and we can move towards standardization of care, albeit maybe a decade late. But we've talked about the reusable rigid laryngoscope, and now you've just talked about the disposable rigid laryngoscope. Can you comment a little on whether there is a place in the market from a patient safety standpoint for the use of a cover or some type of a sheath that would be sterile, that would cover part or all of the rigid laryngoscope, maybe the handle, maybe the blade, maybe both? Can you talk about whether there's a place for that, whether that has become an abandoned practice? Is it growing in practice? Can you talk a little bit about that as we wind down now?
Absolutely. That's a fantastic question. It was one that actually, going back to the California mandate, there's a section in there talking about the sheaths. It was interesting because we have a disposable sheath that works with our reusable laryngoscope handles. So the problem with the disposables as well is that the entire handle gets thrown away, and that's batteries, LEDs, all of the nasty things get thrown away. So we actually designed one where you can use the reusable portion there, all the things that you don't want to throw away, you just throw away a sheath, and we actually call it a sheath. And what we found is that the definition is where there's, I think, some gray area. So again, it comes down to being specific. And I know it's difficult when you write these regulations, understanding how different companies define a sheath, whether it's a plastic cover, whether it's a disposable like we had that was a little bit different. And I do think there is a place to get to answer your question directly. Yes, sir. I do think there's a place. I do think, just like with everything with the regulation, this conversation is the more specific they can be about what is a sheath? What is it defined as? What does it need to do in order to be safe for the patient and safe for use? And then manufacturers can design a sheath that meets it, because I think right now there's a lot of different ones. With the ambiguity of that definition, I'm not sure which ones would necessarily meet the regulation and which ones wouldn't.
Wow, Justin, great conversation.
Yeah, this was phenomenal. And I didn't realize how much conversation the two of you have had in the past, or how far back it went. When Christian and I talked, I guess it was 7 months ago, maybe 8 months ago, that we did our last interview. But I really just liked the whole conversation about how you were critically thinking through the process. And Christian, I have to say, I definitely respect, kind of the position of the organization, right? High quality, let's go the extra mile. Not everybody might be in love with the changes, but, this is the right direction for the industry to have standardization. I can't really think, I know you brought up the example of the dental handpiece, but I can't really think of something so nuanced, that would combine classifications quite the same way, but I can think of lots of other variation as it relates to instructions for use from one manufacturer to another in all sorts of medical devices. And some of it's design related, but some of it also has just a general opportunity, I think, for standardization. And probably the most obvious would be sterilization cycle times. Just allowing the manufacturer to have so many varied ones does present an enormous challenge, especially to efficiency for reprocessing departments such as Central Sterile or others, having to have all these different parameters. So that would probably be the closest tie that I could come to. But I think everybody who's involved in reprocessing knows that there's just a great deal of opportunity for standardization in healthcare when it comes to medical devices. So thanks for talking through your particular experience. And I just love this. I don't think I've ever had a conversation where we spoke to somebody who was a subject matter expert like Larry, and then also the manufacturer like yourself, Christian, and talked about how that interplay helps drive the industry forward with improvements. So really great job, both of you, not only on this podcast, but, over the last 15 years and the way that you evaluated this situation together and tried to come up with, the best thing for the patient and patient outcomes.
No, this has been great. As he said, the history that we have with Dr. Muscarella goes back a long time, and really a pleasure to speak to someone who's such an influencer, and someone, not just an influencer in the market, but also has been a key influencer. Probably he didn't realize, and I hopefully I've conveyed it, how much he's influenced our product. And, specifically the handle that we introduced in 2018 has his DNA all over it from what he did back in 2007 in California. So
I'm very honored. Thank you for that.
Oh, yes, sir.
That was Christian Berling, Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Heine USA. And Larry, I'm not really good. I don't have anything big and profound for the conclusion of this episode other than to say that I really love hearing this very real story about how you and Christian and the company at Heine interacted as you saw, some obvious improvements in the industry and how that conversation really played out over a really long period of time. If you really think about it, I think you wrote that in 2007? 2006?
Yes, I developed a set of guidelines that I thought were logical and really placed patient safety first. And we saw this manufacturer then gravitate toward my guideline. And that even followed the state of California, which wrote a standard based solely and uniquely on my recommendation for reprocessing the blade and handle of rigid laryngoscopes. And I was not a paid consultant. This was simply something done as a public service for the patient. That's how that kind of evolved.
It really took over 14 or 15 years. I mean, I love the timeline awareness for people that are out there listening, because if you think there's areas in the industry where there are obvious areas for improvement, et cetera, you kind of, I almost want to say follow your lead in a way, Larry. Like, you've got to speak up and you've got to say something, because for the industry to shift, it could literally take over a decade from the point where the conversation really starts till something actually goes to market that, fits into a new paradigm or the existing paradigm that helps shape a new paradigm. But either way, this takes time, which is why it takes people who really care, dedicate their time to elevating concerns and creating discussion, very much like we do on this podcast.
And there is one thing that I'd like to kind of tie together here, is that what we talked about today was this issue of standardization of care and the issue about the chicken and the egg and the chicken. Ideally, you want a guideline to dictate a practice, and then you want the manufacturer to then design their device so that it meets those criteria, those safety requirements. And you don't want a situation where the manufacturer is kind of just allowed to do whatever they want. And often that does ensure patient safety, but not always. So I'm glad we talked about standardization of care, and I'm hoping in listening to this podcast that the listeners can appreciate that, to your point, this can take some time, and that's probably good so that we know we have the quality controls in place, but that we move where we standardize care and we treat the rigid laryngoscope like a gastrointestinal endoscope, where it's all one instrument. We don't just disinfect, or high-level disinfect, I should say, the insertion tube, and then low-level disinfect the umbilicus cord, which never contacts the patient. We treat it all as one. The dental handpiece we talked about, we treat the entire instrument as one. Now here we have the rigid laryngoscope, where the handle is treated differently than the blade, and one could argue that may be in part because of convenience. I don't want that to be because of convenience. I want it to be what is the right thing to do and what ensures the patient's safety.
All right. Great episode. Good job, Christian. And you too, Larry. You're almost a guest instead of a host on this episode, in a way that you played a certain part in this story. But that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Transmission Control by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. You can also find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or just search for Transmission Control on your favorite podcast application. We've also got access to bonus content for certain episodes. All you got to do is download our smartphone app for iPhone and Android. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review, because your feedback is important to the show. And on behalf of Larry and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Transmission Control.